All right, so today we are going to dive deep, and I mean deep, into a question that I think really gets at, well, what it means to be human.
Sounds intriguing already.
Right. It has to do with life, death, and, how we view ourselves in relation to others and all that good stuff.
Okay, I'm hooked.
The topic is the ethics of human organ donation.
Oh, wow, organ donation.
Yep, organ donation. It's fascinating because you might think, oh, this is just a medical issue or it's a legal thing.
Right.
And it definitely has those dimensions. But at its core, it is so deeply philosophical.
I can see that.
So to really unpack all the crazy nuances here, we are going to be drawing from a source that I know you, our dear listeners, will appreciate.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
The SEP. Classic. Love it.
It's a treasure trove. For you, our listener, who enjoys a, really rigorous and detailed examination of philosophical debate.
That's our audience.
That's us.
Nerds.
That's our bread and butter.
Lego.
So their entry on organ donation lays out all the big ethical questions with the precision and nuance that this topic deserves.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic.
Okay.
Very heavy.
So our mission, if you choose to accept it, is not to tell you what to believe.
No.
No indoctrination here.
Philosophers don't do that.
We don't do that. No.
Not very well, at least.
No, we don't. But we do want to explore the core ethical questions that come up, when you really think about organ donation.
Okay, I'm with you.
So we're going to be talking about stuff like, how do we even understand ownership of our own bodies? What does that mean?
It's a good question.
It's a huge question. And then the moral weight that we give to families when making decisions at the end of life.
Families, yeah.
Right. And how do we even approach fairness when, we're talking about resources that are so vital, so scarce?
Right. High stakes.
Yeah. As you'll see, there aren't, easy answers here. I know, right? But even just understanding the philosophical framework, that alone helps us kind of navigate this crazy, complex world.
Okay, so where do we begin?
Well, the encyclopedia, right off the bat, points us towards the fundamental, claims at stake here.
Okay, claims, who has a right to what?
Exactly.
Who gets to decide?
Right. So we've got this tension, this inherent tension.
I'm going to lay it on me.
On the one hand, you've got the individual, right? And their claims over their own body.
Makes sense.
During their life.
Sure.
But then also, this gets tricky, after death.
Oh, yeah.
It's what does it even mean to have a claim on your body after you're gone?
Right. Are we talking the right to determine what happens to your remains?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly it. And that's a huge one philosophically.
It is.
Okay, but then you've got families, right?
Of course, families. Always got to bring them in.
Right. And their claims can come from a lot of places, cultural values, deep emotional bonds.
Tradition, love, grief, the whole 9 yards.
Totally.
And sometimes it's even this idea that they inherit rights or responsibilities,
Absolutely.
Carry on the legacy.
And then you can't forget the potential organ recipients.
Yeah.
These are people whose very survival could depend on getting a transplant.
That's a powerful claim.
Right.
So we've got individual, family, recipient.
It's a triangle. It's like a triangle of competing interests.
That's a good way to put it.
And that's where the ethics get really, really messy. It's how do we ethically weigh these different claims,
Right.
Who gets to decide? Who gets priority?
It's not just about should donation happen at all. It's about who gets to make the call.
Exactly. And then if an organ does become available, who gets it? Who goes to the front of the line?
I mean, these are life and death decisions, literally.
They are.
And that's what makes it so philosophically interesting.
Absolutely. Now, before we get too deep into the weeds with the abstract stuff.
Gotta stay grounded.
Right. Let's not forget the real world situation here.
The ground truth.
Exactly. The encyclopedia does a good job of laying out some empirical claims that are important for us to remember.
Okay, so what are we talking about here?
Well, first off, organ transplantation is often very, very successful.
I mean, yeah, we know transplants work.
Right. But it's easy to forget just how effective and life-changing it can be.
True.
And it's often cost-effective, too, compared to, lifelong treatment for organ failure.
Right.
We're talking kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs, pancreas, intestines, all pretty routine procedures these days.
Wow, routine. That's amazing when you think about it.
It is. Modern medicine is incredible.
Yeah.
Now, there are experimental cases, like face transplants and things like that.
Yeah, I've heard about those.
But for this deep dive, we're going to stick to the well-established procedures.
The bread and butter.
Right, the bread and butter.
Yeah.
Okay, but here's the thing, and this is a big thing. The encyclopedia also reminds us that there's a huge shortage of organs.
Oh, yeah, the demand is way higher than the supply.
Way higher. And that's what makes all these ethical questions so urgent and important.
It puts a whole different spin on things, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the philosophy here. The encyclopedia spends a lot of time on the issue of organ retrieval from deceased donors.
Okay, after death.
After death.
Yeah, that's where the what is death question gets really real.
Exactly. I mean, we have these medical definitions, right?
Yeah, like brain death.
Brain death, yeah, or circulatory death. But even with those definitions, the scarcity problem is still massive. There are way more people who need organs than there are organs available, even though, people die every day.
So why is that? Why don't we have enough organs if people are dying all the time?
Well, the encyclopedia outlines a few reasons. It's not just one thing.
Yeah, makes sense.
So one thing is not every death is, suitable for organ donation.
Right, like if someone's been sick for a long time, their organs might not be usable.
Exactly. And a lot of potential donors die in the ICU, the intensive care unit.
Okay.
And then there are the logistics of it all, matching organs with recipients, retrieving the organs, transporting them. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's a delicate process.
Very delicate. And then you have the public awareness piece. Not everyone knows about organ donation or, understands it.
Right. Some people might be afraid of it or have misconceptions.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there are the ethical and legal issues around consent. Who gets to decide if someone's organs can be donated?
Consent, yeah, that's huge.
Huge. But the encyclopedia makes a really interesting point here. They say that these consent rules, while important, they're only one piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so it's not just about the rules.
Not just about the rules. There's a lot more going on.
Interesting. So what else is there?
Well, let's talk about how consent actually works in practice.
Yeah, let's get into it.
It's pretty fascinating and maybe a little counterintuitive. The encyclopedia describes it as a double veto system.
Double veto. Okay, I've never heard that before.
Right. So here's the deal. If the person who died, if they had ever said, I don't want to be an organ donor,
Okay.
then in most countries, that's it.
Game over.
Game over. No donation.
Okay.
Doesn't matter if they signed something or told their family something different later. A no is a no.
Okay, so the person's wishes are respected.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets interesting. Even if the deceased person had said yes to donation, they were all for it,
Okay.
the family can still veto it.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
They can say no, even if the person themselves had said yes.
That's a lot of power.
It is. And sometimes that power comes from laws, but often it's just how things are done in hospitals.
Okay, so it's not always a legal thing. It's more of a cultural thing.
Yeah, it's like an unspoken rule.
Yeah.
Doctors don't want to go against the family's wishes, even if they're not legally obligated to.
I guess it makes sense. It's such a sensitive situation.
Yeah, and no one wants to add to the family's grief, right? But it creates this really interesting dynamic.
It does.
Okay, so the deceased person saying yes isn't always enough, but them saying no, that's pretty much the end of it.
Got it. And the family can override a yes, but not a no.
Exactly. Now here's another wrinkle. In most cases, you don't actually need the deceased person's explicit consent to donate.
Wait, what?
Yeah, it's true.
But I thought you just said.
I know. It's complicated. But basically, if the person hasn't said no to donation and the family is okay with it, then the organs can be donated.
Okay, so it's more about the lack of objection than explicit permission.
Exactly. It's like an opt-out system in a way.
I see.
Japan is a good example here. They only changed their law in 2010 to allow this kind of, implicit consent.
So it's a relatively recent thing in some places.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got this kind of wonky consent system.
Yeah, very wonky.
And unsurprisingly, there are lots of people who want to change it.
Yeah, I bet.
The encyclopedia talks about a bunch of different reform proposals.
To increase donation rates?
Yeah, to increase donation rates and to make the whole thing, more ethically sound.
Makes sense.
And each proposal comes with its own bag of philosophical worms.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
Let's start with the idea of encouraging or even mandating clearer choices.
Okay, so making sure people actually make a decision?
Exactly. The thinking is a lot of families say no Because they just don't know what their loved one would have wanted.
Makes sense.
So the idea is to like nudge people to make a decision, maybe even make it mandatory.
How would you even make it mandatory?
Well, some places have tried things like requiring people to choose when they get their driver's license.
Interesting.
Or, maybe there are financial incentives.
Ooh, that gets tricky.
Right. I mean, is it ethical to pay people to be organ donors?
That's a whole other can of worms.
It is. And then practically speaking, there's no guarantee that it would even work.
Right. People might just check a box without really thinking about it.
Exactly. Some studies have shown that mandated choice doesn't always lead to more donations.
So it's not a silver bullet.
Not a silver bullet. All right, another idea is to get rid of the family veto altogether.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, completely. The argument is that the deceased person's wishes should be paramount.
Okay, I can see that.
If they wanted to donate, their family shouldn't be able to stop it.
Right, especially if it could save someone's life.
Exactly. But there's a lot of pushback on this idea, too.
Why?
Well, for one thing, hospitals are worried about bad PR.
Yeah, they don't want to be seen as insensitive.
Right, and they're also afraid it might actually decrease donations.
How so?
Well, if families are afraid their wishes won't be respected, they might be less likely to support donation in general.
Ah, I see.
And then there's this whole issue of brain death, which we talked about earlier.
Oh, wait, the definition of death.
Right. Not everyone understands it, and some people might be uncomfortable with the idea of organs being taken from someone who, isn't traditionally dead. So if families feel like the system is being rushed or they don't trust the doctors, they might be even more resistant to donation.
Makes sense. It's all about trust.
Exactly. And then philosophically speaking, it's important to remember that no one has a right to have their organs used for transplantation.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Right. Even if they consented, it's more like they have a right to refuse donation.
I see. So it's not a positive right, it's a negative right.
Exactly. Okay, so ending the family vetoes, that's a pretty controversial idea.
Yeah, definitely.
In the U.S., there's been some movement towards what are called first-person consent laws.
Okay, what's that?
Basically, they try to give legal priority to the individual's decision.
Okay.
So if you've signed up to be a donor, your family can't overturn that.
Makes sense.
But the impact of these laws is still unclear.
Yeah, I imagine it's hard to measure.
Yeah, and there are still ethical questions about whether these laws really do respect the wishes of the deceased and their families.
It's a tough one. I mean, how can you truly know what someone would have wanted in every possible situation?
Exactly.
And families are grieving, it's not always a rational decision-making process.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to another big idea, changing the default.
The default.
Yeah. Right now, most places have an opt-in system.
Meaning you have to actively sign up to be a donor.
Exactly. But some people think we should switch to an opt-out system.
So you'd be a donor unless you specifically said no.
Exactly. It's called presumed consent.
Presumed consent. Interesting.
Right. The thinking is a lot of people support donation, but they just never get around to signing up.
Yeah, I can see that.
Inertia,
Wow.
So if the default was yes, more organs would be available.
Makes sense, but are there any downsides?
Oh, tons. Ethically speaking, this is a minefield.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
For one thing, you're taking organs without explicit consent.
That's a big deal.
Huge deal. It's like, are you really respecting people's autonomy if you're assuming they're okay with donation unless they say otherwise?
Yeah, it's tricky. It seems like it could violate people's rights over their own body.
Exactly. And then there's the risk of making a mistake.
Like taking organs from someone who actually didn't want to donate.
Exactly. That's a huge ethical violation. And some philosophers argue that it's even worse than not taking organs from someone who did want to donate but didn't explicitly say so.
I can see their point.
It's all about the balance of harms,
Right.
And then the encyclopedia makes this really interesting observation. They point out that even in the current opt-in systems, most countries already allow for organ retrieval without explicit consent.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Remember how we talked about how families can often consent on behalf of the deceased?
Right.
Well, that means that even now, we're not really requiring explicit consent in every case.
So the argument for presumed consent kind of falls apart a bit there.
Yeah, it becomes less about consent and more about what the default assumption should be.
Right. It's more about framing.
Exactly. Okay, now let's get really radical. Radical. We're talking organ conscription.
Whoa. I know.
Like mandatory organ donation.
Basically, it's not a popular idea, politically speaking.
I can imagine.
But philosophically, it raises some interesting questions.
Okay. Oh, all ears.
The core argument is all about comparing the interests at stake.
Okay. Whose interests?
So, on the one hand, you have the potential recipients. They need these organs to live.
Right. That's a pretty powerful interest.
Right. It's life or death. And then on the other hand, you have the deceased person and their family.
Okay. But they're,
Deceased.
deceased. Yeah.
Right. So the argument is, do their interests regarding the disposition of their body, do those interests really outweigh the right of another person to live?
That's a tough one.
Right. It's a real ethical dilemma.
And what about the family's grief?
Yeah, that's a huge factor, too. Some people think organ conscription would be incredibly traumatic for families.
It would feel like a violation, wouldn't it? Absolutely. Like the state is claiming ownership over their loved one's body.
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow.
It is. But the proponents of conscription, they have some counter-arguments.
Like what?
Well, they point out that we already have things like taxation.
Right.
The government takes a portion of our income even after we die with the state taxes.
Okay.
And the justification is that it's for the greater good.
To fund public services, social safety net, all that.
Exactly. So they argue that organs are a valuable resource and they're no longer needed by the deceased.
I can see where they're going with that.
Right. It's like, why shouldn't we use them to save lives?
So it's like a utilitarian argument, maximizing the good.
Exactly. But then, you run into the whole issue of individual rights versus the good of society.
Yeah, that's always a tension, isn't it?
It is. And it's especially tricky when we're talking about death.
Death makes everything more complicated.
It really does. Okay, so we've talked a lot about deceased donors.
Right.
But there's another side to this coin. Living donors. Oh, yeah, people who donate organs while they're still alive.
Exactly. And the ethics here are a whole different ballgame.
How so?
Well, the initial hope was that deceased donors would be enough.
Right, makes sense.
But the demand for organs is just so high.
Yeah.
So we've become increasingly reliant on living donors.
I mean, I know people who have donated kidneys to family members.
Right. And it's not just kidneys anymore, livers too.
Wow.
In 2019, there were a ton of live kidney and liver transplants.
That's amazing.
It is. And the idea of who can be a living donor, that's evolved a lot too.
How so?
Well, it used to be mostly just close relatives.
Yeah, makes sense.
But now, in some places, you can donate to friends, spouses, even complete strangers.
Wow, complete strangers. That's incredible.
It is, but it raises a huge ethical question.
What's that?
It's basically this. Is it okay to impose risks on a healthy person for no benefit to themselves?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Right. Because even a minor surgery has risks.
Of course. Infection, complications, who knows? Exactly. And with organ donation, we're talking about potentially serious long-term risks.
Right.
Well, depending on the organ, you could have chronic pain, reduced quality of life, even a shorter lifespan.
That's serious.
Very serious. So how can we justify putting someone through that when they don't even need the surgery?
Right. It's not like it's going to cure them of something.
Exactly.
So what's the argument here?
Well, almost everyone agrees that consent is key.
Okay, so the donor has to agree to it.
Absolutely. But even then, some people argue that it's never really okay no matter how much someone consents.
I wonder what their reasoning is.
They worry about things like coercion, pressure from family or society to donate.
Right.
And they also question whether anyone can truly understand the risks involved until they actually experience them.
That's a good point. It's one thing to imagine a risk, it's another to actually live it.
Exactly. But the majority view is that with proper safeguards, living donation can be ethical.
Okay, so what are those safeguards?
Well, first and foremost, consent has to be truly free and informed.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, it means the donor isn't being forced or coerced in any way.
Right.
And they need to understand the risks and benefits fully.
Yeah, no sugarcoating.
No sugarcoating. And the donor needs to be competent to make this kind of decision.
Meaning they're mentally capable, right?
Exactly. Not a child, not someone with a cognitive impairment that would prevent them from understanding. Now, this is where it gets tricky again. Because what about situations where the donor is a close relative of the recipient?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Right, there's a lot of emotional pressure in those cases.
Of course, you want to save your loved one's life.
Exactly, and sometimes that pressure can feel like coercion, even if no one is explicitly saying, you have to do this.
Yeah, it's like an unspoken obligation.
Exactly, and transplant teams have to be really careful about that.
How do they handle it?
Well, They do these psychosocial evaluations, try to assess the donor's motivations, make sure they're not being unduly influenced.
Okay, that makes sense.
But even that is tricky.
How so?
Well, how do you define undue influence?
Right.
What if the donor feels a strong religious obligation to donate, for example?
Yeah, that gets complicated.
It does. It's a gray area. And the encyclopedia brings up this interesting point about white lies.
White lies.
Yeah, like sometimes if a potential donor is feeling pressured but doesn't want to disappoint their family, the transplant team might encourage them to say they're not medically eligible to donate.
Oh, wow. So they give them a way out.
Exactly. It's a way to protect the donor from that pressure.
That's really interesting.
It is. Okay, so even with valid consent, there are still some big ethical questions.
Like what?
Well, what about cases where the donation involves a really significant risk to the donor?
Like donating a kidney when you only have one.
Exactly. Or donating an organ that's essential for life.
That's a huge sacrifice.
It is. And some people argue that even with consent, we shouldn't allow that.
Out of concern for the donor.
Yeah, it's this whole debate about paternalism. You know, when is it okay for society to step in and say, no, you can't do this, even if you want to?
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
Right. We want to respect people's autonomy, but we also want to protect them from harm.
Especially when the harm could be permanent or even fatal.
Exactly. And organ donation, it's unique because there's this other person involved, the recipient.
Right.
They stand to benefit enormously from the donation.
So it's not just about the donor's risks and benefits, it's about the recipients too.
Exactly. And that makes the ethical calculus even more complex.
For sure.
Now, the encyclopedia suggests that for most living donations, the balance tips in favor of allowing them.
Because the benefit to the recipient is so great.
Right. And because the donors are usually making rational decisions based on their own values.
Okay, so not just emotional decisions.
Right. But when you start talking about, like, donating a vital organ, the line gets a lot blurrier.
Yeah, I can see that.
In those cases, you really have to make sure the consent is rock solid.
And that there's no coercion.
No coercion. Okay, one last thing on living donation. What about incompetent donors?
Incompetent?
Yeah, like children or people with severe mental disabilities.
Right, they can't give consent.
Exactly. So if consent is absolutely necessary, then donation from these people would never be allowed.
Right, ethically speaking.
Right. But the encyclopedia raises the question, does it have to be that way?
Good question.
What if there are situations where it might be ethical to allow donation from an incompetent donor?
Like what?
Well, some people argue that the benefit to the recipient outweighs the potential harm to the donor.
Okay, so a utilitarian argument again.
Exactly. And they point out that in some cases, the donor might not even experience any harm.
Like if they're too young to understand what's happening.
Right. Or if they have a condition that prevents them from feeling pain, for example.
Interesting.
And then there's this idea of substituted judgment. Basically, it's like trying to figure out what the person would have wanted if they could have made the decision themselves.
Yeah, but how do you do that if they've never been competent?
Right. It's very tricky. And some people think it's impossible.
Yeah, it seems like you're just guessing at that point.
You are.
Right.
But the encyclopedia points out that there can be real benefits to the incompetent donor, too.
Like what?
Well, if they donate to a sibling, for example, that sibling's survival could benefit them indirectly.